Start my OA. So my OA might be a bit short since the restriction of time. I'm maybe going to focus on the important issue. If you have any questions, please reach out to me or my panelists. They had wonderful opinions too. Cool. So I'll just jump straight into my call and then onto justification. We thought that first goes to closing gov, second goes to opening op, third goes to opening gov, last unfortunately to closing op. CG, OO, OG, CO, we thought that the opening bench comparison was a rather tight one. Then I want to start with the opening bench comparison, why I think opening opposition wins over opening government. I think there were mainly two clashes here. Firstly, what does the LGBTQ people want from the movement? And secondly, why does it succeed in the legal framework? So firstly, as to what does first clash about what do the LGBTQ movement want from people want from the movement? This clash is particularly important because I do think both sides agree that support from inside the movement is important to achieve change to happen, whether it's traditional or legal. And also, I do think it both connects to the psychological impact that both teams wanted to push. Opening government push here was to say that these kind of familial values and the importance of it are likely to be imprinted with you to a day-to-day basis, because you have been grown up in a traditional family, or you see families outside of your LGBTQ family community. Thus, you're gonna feel important and you want it. But the opposition here argues that you want to gain psychological comfort because you think that familial value is somewhat inachievable for you because of maybe biological reasons or because of maybe legal framework not being friendly towards you. I think both sides had good characterization, but I do think opening government takes this by saying that telling me as to how LGBTQ people are likely to feel within these kind of day-to-day basis and why they're likely to have it is likely. However, the tricky part here is that I think the opening government, although they were able to identify what does the LGBTQ people want, I'm not sure as to how they're going to achieve it on their counterfactual, meaning that when they do not succeed, i.e. when they are not able to garner change on the government counterfactual, I think that is the point in which the opening opposition's harm is likely to be increased, meaning that even if they do want maybe these kind of change to happen initially, even if they do pursue it, and even if they do pursue it, and even if they do maybe contribute to the movement, if they not achieve it, that is at the point in which opening opposition's harm, that is to say, you are going to be hurt because you feel that you are being denied by traditional norms, and you feel that you're not going to achieve it, is being admitted, if that makes sense. So I think in order for the opening government's impact to stand, I think the second clash here about does it succeed in the legal framework becomes incredibly important. I think both sides implicitly agree that legal framework is somewhat important, especially when maybe the Prime Minister and also the Deputy Prime Minister has examples about how maybe gay marriage is important or how they want to be recognized as family is there. I think there are attempts from DPM to try to small this kind of importance of these kind of impacts by saying that they shouldn't be recognized, as long as I think opening government also talks about legal frameworks and considered this to be important. I think this has to be an important clash within the opening half exchange. Also, I just want to quickly touch upon the traditional values, which is also what Prime Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister wants to push. The reason as to why I think traditional framework of maybe family couldn't be taken to the full extent is because although I did see maybe the problem identification there, I didn't see as to how that's going to change the government counterfactual, meaning that how people are maybe people who are maybe non-LGBTQ members are likely to perceive the LGBTQ people as a newly family because uniquely of the advocation was not really uniquely present coming from the opening government, meaning that I think the legal framework was somewhat maybe the practical change was the main contention within the opening half exchange. I think the opening government push here is to say that because this is intuitive for the people, and because this familial change or the importance of familial value here is important for the people, there's likely to be more buy-in. There's going to be there's going to be change. This is important because it leads to legal frameworks changing and practical issues changing. This also connects to the practical impact about how the minorities within the minorities are likely to gain a hope within these kind of things. I think that they also do agree that there needs to be like a lot of people and a lot of money in order to achieve this change. But I think like the big question I had here, and also by pointed out by I think the DLO, was to say that why people who are not really interested in the status quo are likely to change to maybe actively supporting to the extent that there's going to be maybe legal change happening. I think like I do think that maybe this messaging might be like intuitive for people, but I'm not sure as to how this becomes a tipping point for the people to actively join these kind of movements. Especially when I think opening opposition has really good mitigations in suggesting that in terms of number or in terms of political incentive, it is quite unlikely that politicians have like time in order to like discuss this and in order to push for these kind of changes to actually happen. So the conclusion here is to say that I think like I'm leading towards the opening opposition, in which that even if this motion is there and advocates, there is not likely that there's going to be immediate like maybe legal framework change or maybe a lot of legal framework changing actually happening because of existing problems within the status quo and because of maybe the problems within like the political sphere. Meaning that although I do think opening opposition doesn't really have like a really good positive, I think that they were able to tell me as to how it is better for people for like the movement to have like a different messaging in saying that it is okay to just love each other and that is just okay for you, rather than maybe pursuing what is achievable, what is not really achievable, and being hurt by it. So just to conclude, I do think like opening government is correct in identifying that maybe these kind of people want the change to happen. However, as long as they cannot prove as to why that change is going to happen, I'm not sure if that is like impact that is going to happen. But rather, I think when the change is not likely to happen, the opening opposition's like impact and characterization about how people are going to be hurt because they are like pursuing what is not achievable is being rather strengthened within like the opening half exchange. So for these reasons, I think like opening opposition takes over opening government. Moving on to the closing government and why I think they are able to win against both opening benches. I think like closing government's extension was to say that you are going to have uniquely have ties and collaborations with hospitals and local governments because you are likely to align with the fact these kind of institutions are likely to align with the messaging that families are important for you because obviously they are embracing families, I guess. The way in which they are likely to do this is that they approach the parents who have newborn babies and tell them how to act within the family. And most people are centrist, and at least they have like the recognition is incredibly important because it prevents maybe harms in terms of like microaggression to happen in childhood, which is highlighted, which the importance is highlighted within like the government whip when they say that childhood is a really important because it like forms personality and it affects your whole life, etc. So why I think closing government is able to take over opening government. Although I do think opening government attempts like a higher and a big burden case about like political changes happening and continuation of these kind of things are likely to trickle down to the minority in general. As I said it in my opening half exchange, I think they lacked mechanisms of how this is likely to happen in the first place. Um, I think that when both teams agree that change of minorities needed, I think closing government provides to me more like concrete mechanism of how we can like change in a more immediate manner in terms of approaching like the people who are more likely to listen to you, i.e. the mothers, who are maybe likely to be central liberal. And this is a certain impact in terms of preventing the harm about microaggression, which is likely to happen in the course of these children growing up. Moving on to the CGOO exchange and why I think closing government takes over opening opposition. So the first thing is that I think like opening opposition is although able to point out the harm which is going to happen in the government counterfactual, which is to say that preventing like the inferiority of the LGBTQ members to not feel a sense of inferiority. I think as pointed out by other benches, I think like it is kind of limited. Firstly, I think like the scope may be a bit limited because I don't think they identify as to how big they are or how big these demography are or how likely they are likely to feel. Maybe like some people might feel like a sense of inferiority, but I'm not sure as to how this is look like. I think closing government in like the contrary are able to provide like a bigger harm prevention, which is certainly which are likely to happen when they at the point in which they illustrate that these kind of microaggressions are something that minorities inherently are likely to a lot of minorities are likely to experience in the childhood. I think they emphasize like the harm by explaining as to why childhood is an important time for these kind of minorities specifically, preventing like a universal harm for maybe a lot of people on the closing government in the team of closing government. So to summarize, I think like closing government is able to firstly depict as to what is the severity of the harm they are likely to protect, but secondly as to explain as to how much people are likely to be affected uniquely on the government counterfactual. So it is CG over OO. Lastly, moving on to closing opposition and why unfortunately we thought that although the attempts were there, they took fourth in this round. I think like the extension coming from the closing opposition is to say that on the opposition counterfactual, there is a usage of the resource to form a community, for example, like forming a shelter. This is important for people who hold the trauma to the family or people who don't really have sexual desires. Moving on to the COO exchange, I think like the attempts coming from closing opposition was to say that providing like a more structural structural salvation towards like the opening opposition's case. However, the first thing is that I think opening opposition already states as to why this doesn't really matter, why not mattering, and why the opposition counterfactual and why the messaging in and of itself is uniquely good for the minorities psychologically. I think that there needed to be explanation of why forming a shelter, etc., and why these kind of communal support is an additional benefit, which overrides maybe the opening opposition. Because I do think, secondly, opening opposition provides like addresses a more broader scope of like people, which are maybe minorities who are maybe devastated that nothing is going to change in the government counterfactual. As opposed to that, I do think closing opposition they themselves concede and they themselves know that the closing opposition only address a small amount of people, because for their impacts to unlock and for their impacts to be their impacts only applies to the people who are maybe passionate enough or maybe who hate the familial structure to the extent that they move into like a shelter and they like maybe buy into these kind of shelter in the first place. So I think like the thing here is that although I do see like the attempts, I think opening opposition already has salvation. But the second thing is that I think the scope is maybe limited in terms of capacity wise, because I think opening opposition's like impact is just unlocked by the messaging, but closing opposition needs to have maybe shelters which are inherently limited in terms of capacity. Moving on to the OG-CO comparison and why we think opening government takes over like closing opposition. The first thing is that I think like the premise of the closing opposition's argument is to say that there are many people who are holding the trauma to the extent that they need the shelter and another community. The reasoning for this is that I think member had like examples of saying that toxic familial structures and lack of like sexual desires, etc. The first thing is that I think like at the top of opening government speech, they tell us as to why there's likelihood of interactions with different circles outside of like the LGBTQ community, and your identity is not just based on the fact that you are a minority, meaning that I think a lot of like yeah, I think it is limited. I think it limits like the scope of CO's argument of saying that a lot of people like hate their families. But the second thing is that I think pointed out by the POI to like the member of opposition, I think the link of having a toxic family equals to hating the familial structure was rather lacking coming from like the closing opposition. I think this is true, especially true when the opening government especially points out that these kind of traumas are likely to be independent towards like the individuals rather than like the system itself. I think like closing opposition needed to have that specific link in terms of proving this. Although I do think like opening government does not prove as to why maybe a societal change is likely to happen, as pointed out by the member of opposition. At least maybe they were able to prove to me as to how maybe running from their hope is good for some people who maybe want the family as they have characterized, meaning that I do think they had somewhat at least some positive impact, which were mechanized. Yeah. Jubilee, I guess. Lastly, onto the CG-CO exchange, and I think like closing government wins over closing opposition. I think like the thing here is that I think, as pointed out by other like exchanges, I think the certainty of impact is significant coming from like the closing government when they say that the children are likely to be affected and this is in concrete harm towards them. I think like the attempts coming from the member of opposition, and I do think maybe the whip too, is to say that these are the people who are conservative doesn't matter. But the reason as to why I don't think this was a really strong response is, firstly, I do think closing government does not attempt to save everyone, including the conservatives. But also they say that how the centrists and the left people are likely to be the main scope of this target, meaning that Although I do see the mitigation, I'm not sure as to how big those kind of conservative targets are in the first place. But the second thing is that I do think that there is some mitigations coming from the member of government speech, when they say that these mothers and fathers are likely to care for maybe their newborn babies, meaning that they are likely to maybe listen to them more. I think like closing opposition then lacks analysis as to say why this maybe conservative value matters more than maybe the love of the parents. Although I do think like closing government does not, as pointed out by closing opposition, does not really fully prove as to why maybe the conservative people are going to change. I do think that they are able to engage in centrist and leftist people, and also maybe some conservative people who love their children, meaning that there is certain change in the closing government side. So the call is CGOOOGCO. After this, I think there's going to be like feedback towards like the competitive judges. So I request you all to move to the Discord. Thank you all for a wonderful round, and good luck for the last round too.
ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。